Every year, without fail, the same thing happens. The internet rallies behind the biggest releases, the loudest trailers, and the most expensive marketing campaigns. And somewhere in the noise, genuinely brilliant games get completely swallowed up. No coverage, no word of mouth, no algorithm push. Just incredible work from talented developers that released quietly, got ignored, and slowly faded into obscurity, while far lesser games dominated every conversation. And that is genuinely frustrating, because some of the most creative, most original, and most memorable gaming experiences of the last decade are sitting in games most people have never even heard of. These games deserved better. They deserved the reviews, the streams, the community, and the recognition that went to titles that honestly didn't earn it half as much. Today, we're giving them that moment. These are the underrated games that deserved way more attention, and it's never too late to discover them. Let's get into it.
Alan Wake had to wait more than a decade to get the audience it always deserved. Remedy released it in 2010 as a psychological thriller wrapped around a flashlight-based combat system, fighting shadow-possessed enemies in a fog-drenched Pacific Northwest town clearly inspired by Twin Peaks. Reviews were strong, but a shift in publisher plans and a quiet marketing push meant it never got the push a game this ambitious needed. Sales were modest enough that a true sequel looked dead for years. The cult following never gave up, and Remedy kept the story alive through spin-offs and hints. Alan Wake 2 finally arrived in 2023 to massive acclaim, and it sent an entire new generation of players back to discover just how ahead of its time the original really was. The marketing for this game basically guaranteed nobody would play it. Spec Ops: The Line was sold in 2012 as just another brown and gray military shooter, cover-based combat, nothing that stood out on a shelf full of Call of Duty clones. That framing killed it commercially before players ever discovered what was actually inside. The game deliberately used every cliché of the genre to build toward one of the most controversial, talked about sequences in gaming history. A story about the horror of war and the lies soldiers tell themselves to keep going. Sales were poor enough that the studio moved away from the franchise for good. Over a decade later, it's still taught in game design courses as a masterclass in subverting what players expect.
Sleeping Dogs almost never existed, and even after it launched, barely anyone noticed. It started life as True Crime Hong Kong, got cancelled by Activision in the development, and was rescued at the last minute by Square Enix. When it finally released in 2012, it landed in a crowded year of open-world games and struggled to stand out despite strong reviews. Players who picked it up found a brutally satisfying martial arts combat system and one of the most authentic depictions of Hong Kong ever put into a game. It never sold like a blockbuster, but everyone who played it remembers it. A planned sequel was canceled years later anyway. In 2026, Sleeping Dogs is still one of the most underrated open-world games of its generation.
Sunset Overdrive had some of the best traversal ever built into a shooter, and it launched on the one console fewer people owned. Insomniac built this wildly colorful, irreverent open-world game in 2014 exclusively for Xbox One, grinding rails, bouncing off cars, chaining kills with genuinely ridiculous weapons. Critics loved its personality immediately. Sales never came close to matching the ambition, partly because it launched on hardware a huge chunk of the audience simply hadn't bought yet. Microsoft never greenlit a sequel, and the game slowly slipped out of the conversation. Ironically, Insomnia carried the lessons from its traversal design straight into their Spider-Man games years later. In 2026, fans are still asking for a follow-up that will probably never come.
This got some of the best reviews of any Marvel game ever made, and almost nobody bought it. Marvel's Guardians of the Galaxy launched in October 2021 into one of the most crowded release windows of that year, right next to Halo Infinite and a wave of other big titles, and it got lost immediately. Square Enix publicly called the sales disappointing. What players missed was a genuinely funny, emotionally sharp Star-Lord story with a killer 80s soundtrack, sharp dialogue, and combat that never overstayed its welcome. There was no live service grind here, just a tightly made, single-player adventure that critics loved from day one. It never got the numbers it earned. In 2026, it's still one of the most recommended Marvel games nobody talks about.
Days Gone got written off in the first week and quietly became one of PlayStation's best sellers anyway. When it launched in 2019, reviewers called it generic, slow to start, and technically rough. Just another zombie game riding on Sony's reputation. Players who ignored the scores and stuck with it found an unexpectedly emotional story about grief and loyalty, layered on top of some of the best horde-based combat ever built into an open-world game. Word of mouth did what review scores couldn't, and sales kept climbing long after launch week. Ben's studio pitched a sequel that got turned down anyway. The fanbase never stopped asking for one. In 2026, Days Gone still has one of the loudest, most persistent communities demanding a second chance.
Mad Max released on the exact same day as Metal Gear Solid V, and that single scheduling decision buried it. Avalanche Studios built a genuinely excellent open-world wasteland game in 2015, brutal car combat, deep vehicle customization, and a tone that actually felt true to the films it was borrowing from. Critics gave it solid reviews, but the conversation that week belonged entirely to Kojima's swan song, and Mad Max faded out of the spotlight within days. There was no scandal, no broken launch, just terrible timing that killed its momentum before players even had a chance to notice it existed. Years later, people going back to it are consistently surprised by how tight the combat and world design actually are. In 2026, it's one of the most recommended hidden gems in the open world genre. Titanfall 2 had one of the best campaigns ever made, and almost nobody played it in its first month. It launched in October 2016, sandwiched between Battlefield 1 and Call of Duty Infinite Warfare, arguably the worst release window a shooter has ever picked. The single-player campaign is still held up as one of the smartest in the genre, especially one time-bending level that regularly gets ranked among gaming's best missions. The multiplayer built a wall-running mech-piloting movement system players still call unmatched a decade later. Reviews were glowing across the board. Sales still fell far short of what Respawn needed. The community that stuck around kept servers alive through sheer stubbornness. Even now, Titanfall 2 gets recommended constantly to anyone who missed it the first time. Most people skipped this game just because of its name. Prey came out in 2017, sharing its title with a completely unrelated shooter from 2006, and that alone confused enough buyers to hurt its opening week. What Arcane actually built was one of the smartest immersive sims of the decade, a slow-burn horror thriller on an abandoned space station, where every vent, coffee mug, and locked door could hide a puzzle or a shape-shifting enemy. Critics handed it some of the best scores of the year. Players just never showed up in the numbers it needed. No true sequel ever followed. Immersive sim fans have kept its reputation alive ever since, and in 2026, it's still the go-to recommendation whenever someone asks for a game that respects their intelligence. Darksiders 2 launched to strong reviews, and then the publisher behind it collapsed within weeks. THQ released Darksiders 2 in August 2012, a sprawling action-adventure starring Death, one of the Four Horsemen, blending Zelda-style dungeons with loot-driven combat and a genuinely massive world to explore. Critics liked it more than the original. Before the game could build real momentum, THQ filed for bankruptcy, and the franchise's future went dark overnight. The IP bounced between publishers for years afterward, and the series never got the sustained support a game this ambitious needed. Fans kept the community alive regardless, and later re-releases introduced it to a new generation. In 2026, it's still remembered as one of the best action-adventure games orphaned by circumstances outside its own control. It took a full decade for this game to finally get the sequel it always deserved. Dragon's Dogma launched from Capcom in 2012 into a year packed with bigger releases, and its expanded edition, Dark Horizon, followed in 2013 with a full new region and endgame content bolted on. The combat system let players climb onto giant monsters mid-fight and grab weak points directly, something few action RPGs had attempted at that scale. Reviews respected it, but it never broke into the mainstream conversation the way it deserved. A small but fiercely loyal fanbase kept demanding a follow-up for years. Dragon's Dogma 2 finally released in 2024 to a much bigger audience, proving the original had been quietly ahead of its time the whole way through.
This launched the same month as Cyberpunk 2077 and never had a chance to be noticed. Immortals: Phoenix Rising came out in December 2020, a whimsical Greek mythology open world clearly inspired by Breath of the Wild, built by Ubisoft with genuine charm and clever puzzle design across its floating islands and god-powered abilities. Reviews were solid, and players who actually tried it found a lighter, funnier alternative to Ubisoft's usual open world formula. But it launched into the single most crowded release month of that entire generation, buried under Cyberpunk 2077 and other massive titles competing for the same attention. Sales were modest despite the quality. In 2026, it's still one of the most overlooked entries in Ubisoft's entire catalog.
This game got announced and released on the exact same day, and the studio that made it got shut down anyway. Hi-Fi Rush dropped as a surprise in January 2023, a rhythm action game where every hit, dash, and dodge syncs perfectly to the beat of the soundtrack. Critics called it one of the most creative games of that year almost instantly. Because it launched straight into Game Pass with zero traditional marketing, a huge chunk of the potential audience never even knew it existed. Despite the acclaim, Tango Gameworks, the studio behind it, was shut down the following year during industry-wide layoffs. The game's reputation only grew after that, with players calling it one of the biggest missed opportunities of the decade. In 2026, it's still one of the clearest examples of quality not guaranteeing survival.
Ghost Runner is a one-hit kill cyberpunk parkour game that most players have still never heard of. A small Polish studio called One More Level released it in 2020 with almost no marketing budget, throwing players into a neon-lit dystopia where a single touch from any enemy means instant death, forcing pure precision and constant restarts. The learning curve is brutal by design, but the movement feels incredible once it clicks, running on walls, slicing through waves of enemies in seconds. Critics who found it praised the tight difficulty and style immediately. It never got the marketing push bigger cyberpunk games received that same era. A sequel followed in 2023 to a much bigger audience. In 2026, the original is still the better-kept secret of the two. A tiny animation studio nobody expected made one of the most gorgeous games of 2021, and it barely made a dent in the conversation. Ember Lab had never made a full game before Kena: Bridge of Spirits, and it showed in the best possible way. Painterly visuals, a moving story about grief, and combat that borrowed smartly from bigger action games. It launched with real technical rough edges on PS5 that held reviews back slightly. Without a massive publisher marketing budget behind it, word of mouth had to carry the whole thing. It swept visual and audio awards that year, despite modest sales. Players who found it consistently call it one of the most beautiful games ever made by a first-time studio. In 2026, it's still one of the most recommended sleeper hits around.